The galactic archives existed at the center of everything. They floated in a pocket of folded space where time moved slowly and data lasted forever. For 12 billion years, the archivists had watched the universe. They recorded every species that ever lived. They measured every civilization that rose and fell. They kept the memory of 10 million intelligent races in their crystal storage banks. The archivists themselves were ancient beyond measure. They had evolved past the need for bodies long ago. Now they existed as patterns of light and thought moving through halls of pure information. Their purpose was simple but endless. They watched, they recorded, they remembered. Their greatest invention was the wound index. Every species that achieved intelligence faced challenges. Asteroids struck their worlds. Ice ages froze their crops. Plagues swept through their cities. Wars tore apart their societies. The wound index measured all of it. It tracked every disaster survived, every catastrophe weathered, every self-inflicted horror endured. It calculated the total damage a species had absorbed and compared it to their continued survival. Most species scored between 12 and 340. After that, they either transcended to something beyond physical existence, or they simply stopped. They gave up. They ended themselves. The weight of accumulated trauma became too heavy to carry. Senior Archivist had served in the archives for 300 years. In that time, it had compiled data on countless species. It had seen civilizations rise from primitive hunters to galactic powers. It had watched others crumble under the weight of a single war or one bad century. Nothing surprised anymore. Until the humans. The species from the Orion Spur had been discovered by accident. A survey drone had picked up their radio signals leaking into space. The signals were messy and unorganized, full of music and arguments and strange fiction. The archivists had flagged them for study and began gathering data. Had taken the assignment expecting nothing unusual. Another young species fumbling toward the stars. Another brief entry in the eternal records. It began compiling their history from the signals they broadcast and the observations of automated probes. The work took 3 years, was thorough. It traced human development from their earliest tool use to their current global civilization. Their wars, their plagues, their natural disasters, their self-inflicted wounds. It fed everything into the wound index algorithm and waited for the score. The number that appeared made no sense. 4,847. Ran the calculation again. The same number appeared. It ran diagnostics on the algorithm. Everything functioned correctly. It requested independent verification from 3 other archivists. They confirmed the score. 4,847. The previous record holder had been the morning shells of Andromeda. They were a beautiful species, their bodies like living gemstones that sang when they moved. They had survived asteroid impacts, ice ages, and a devastating civil war. Their score reached 2,100 before they simply stopped. Every last one of them had walked into their oceans and refused to surface. They left behind a single message: "We are tired." The humans had doubled that score, and they were still going. Requested permission to form an observation team. The request was granted immediately. The Galactic Council wanted answers. How could any species survive such accumulated damage? What made the humans different? The observation team arrived in the Sol system quietly. They kept their ships hidden behind the planet's moon and sent microscopic probes to the surface. They tapped into human data networks and began to study. What they found horrified them. The humans lived on a planet that actively tried to kill them. The ground shook and opened beneath their cities. Mountains exploded and buried entire regions in fire and ash. The weather spawned spinning columns of destruction that tore apart everything in their path. The planet froze and thawed in cycles that reshaped continents. And the humans had made it worse. They had cut down their forests until the soil washed away. They had poisoned their rivers and oceans with waste. They had filled their atmosphere with gases that trapped heat and changed their climate. They were actively making their own world less habitable, and they knew it, and they kept doing it anyway. Their history was a catalog of nightmares. They had developed weapons that could destroy cities in a single flash of light. They had built systems of organized cruelty, where members of their own species were bought and sold like objects. They had constructed factories designed purely to kill as many of their own kind as possible. The observation team sent back their initial report with a request for guidance. They did not understand what they were seeing. Every model of species psychology said the humans should have collapsed generations ago. The trauma was too great. The damage was too deep. No species could absorb this much pain and continue functioning. But the humans were not merely functioning. They were building. They were creating. They were looking up at the stars and planning how to reach them. Studied the data for months. It watched humans go about their daily lives. It observed them working and resting and gathering in groups. It listened to their conversations and their music and their stories. Something was wrong with the archivist's models. Something fundamental about human psychology operated differently than expected. The breakthrough came when began studying human entertainment. Other species created art to celebrate beauty or explore philosophy. Humans did this too, but they also created something else. They created stories about their own extinction. They made elaborate visual productions about plagues wiping out their civilization. They wrote tales of nuclear war and environmental collapse and alien invasion. They paid money to sit in dark rooms and watch simulations of their own deaths. And they enjoyed it. Brought this observation to the full Archivist Council. The reaction was confusion bordering on alarm. Why would any species seek out simulations of their greatest fears? What possible purpose could this serve? The council decided that direct contact was necessary. The usual protocols required centuries of observation before first contact, but the humans were an anomaly that demanded immediate investigation. The Galactic Council itself had taken an interest. They wanted to know if humans were dangerous or damaged or something else entirely. The invitation was drafted carefully. It acknowledged humanity's achievements and requested a representative to address the assembled civilizations of the galaxy. It promised safe passage and diplomatic immunity. It was transmitted on frequencies the humans could detect and waited for a response. The response came within days. The humans were eager, perhaps too eager. They selected their representative and prepared her for a journey that no human had ever taken. Her name was Wei, and she had been chosen because she carried the most scars. Her file was remarkable even by human standards. She had survived a childhood accident that left half her body burned. She had lost family to violence and disease. She had witnessed firsthand the worst her species could do to itself and had spent her career trying to prevent it from happening again. By any reasonable measure, she should have been broken. Instead, she volunteered. The observation team brought her to the Galactic Council's meeting place. She was small by human standards, older, with white streaking her dark hair. She moved carefully, like someone who had learned that the universe was not to be trusted, but she did not move fearfully. 400 civilizations waited to hear her speak. Representatives from every corner of the galaxy had gathered to witness this moment. Some were curious. Some were afraid. Some simply wanted to understand how any species could endure what the humans had endured and remain standing. Watched from the observation gallery. After 3 years of study, it was no closer to understanding humans than when it started. Perhaps the ambassador could explain what the data could not. Perhaps she could illuminate the strange resilience that every model the archivists possessed. Or perhaps the answer would be something they were not prepared to hear. The council chamber fell silent. Ambassador Wei stepped forward to speak, and in that moment the archivists began to learn what the wound index had never been designed to measure. Ambassador Wei looked out at the gathered representatives and felt something she had not expected. She felt calm. After everything she had survived, after every scar she carried, standing before 400 alien civilizations seemed almost ordinary. The chamber was vast beyond human architecture. It curved upward in impossible spirals, filled with floating platforms where beings of every imaginable shape waited to hear her words. Some looked vaguely familiar, like variations on animals she knew. Others were so strange that her mind refused to fully process them. Light creatures, crystal formations, things that existed in angles her eyes could not follow. A translation device had been implanted behind her ear. It would convert her words into whatever each species needed to understand. She had been told to simply speak naturally. The technology would handle the rest. "You invited me here because you want to understand," she began. Her voice carried through the chamber, translated into 1,000 languages simultaneously. "You want to know how my species survives. I have studied your wound index. I have seen our score. I understand why you are confused." A ripple passed through the assembly. The archivists had shared the data. Everyone present knew the number. 4,847. It hung over the proceedings like a weight. "The honest answer is that we do not know." Pause to let the translation settle. "We have no secret. We have no special technology for healing. We simply refuse to stop." A being made of crystalline structures rose from a nearby platform. The translation device identified it as the delegate. Its species had nearly been destroyed by a single asteroid impact 3 million years ago. They had taken 200,000 years to recover. Their wound index score was 94. "That is not an answer," they said. Its voice was like glass chimes in wind. "Refusal is not a mechanism. All species refuse at first. All species eventually accept. What makes your refusal different?" Had expected this question. She had prepared for it during her journey. But standing here, facing creatures who had studied her species like specimens, she decided to abandon her prepared remarks. "Let me show you instead," she said. "Let me show you what we are." She accessed the display system she had been granted. The chamber filled with images from Earth's history. She started with ice ages, sheets of frozen white swallowing continents, humans huddled in caves, burning anything they could find for warmth, eating whatever they could catch. "This happened to us many times," she said. "Each time we should have died. We had no fur, no natural weapons, no special adaptations for cold. We survived by being stubborn. We survived by refusing to admit we were beaten." The images shifted. Plague swept through cities. Bodies piled in streets. People fled in terror from diseases they could not see or understand. "This happened to us regularly. One plague killed half our population in a single century. We did not have medicine yet. We did not understand what was killing us, but we buried our dead and kept living. We had children and raised them and taught them everything we knew so that maybe they could do better." More images, wars, ancient battles with swords and arrows, modern conflicts with bombs and bullets, the atomic flash over Hiroshima, the mushroom cloud rising like a terrible flower. "We did this to ourselves," said quietly. "We invented weapons that could destroy our entire species, and then we used them, twice. And then we kept building more, knowing exactly what they could do." They made a sound like shattering glass. Distress. Other delegates shifted uncomfortably on their platforms. "You must think we are insane," continued. "Perhaps we are. We certainly act like it sometimes, but we are still here. We are still building. We are still reaching for the stars. And the reason is not something you will find in genetic code or psychological profiles." She rolled up her sleeve, revealing the scars that covered her left arm. Burned tissue, white and ridged, running from her wrist to her shoulder. The result of a fire when she was 7 years old. On Earth, we call these scars. They are damaged tissue that has healed wrong. They are weaker than normal skin in some ways and stronger in others. They mark us. They remind us of what we survived. She traced a finger along the largest ridge. "Among my people, scars are not shameful. They are proof that we endured something terrible and came out the other side." She lowered her sleeve and looked directly at the archivist representative. It floated in a bubble of preserved atmosphere, its light form flickering with attention. "Your wound index measures damage. It counts our catastrophes and calculates our trauma, but it misses something important. It does not measure what we do with that damage. It does not track how we transform our wounds into something else." "What do you transform them into?" the archivist asked. "Memory," said. "Purpose. Warning. We build monuments to our dead so we never forget them. We tell stories about our worst moments so our children will know to avoid them. We create art from our pain so that others who suffer will know they are not alone." She brought up new images, museums dedicated to genocide, memorial walls covered in names, children learning about wars their grandparents survived. "We are not resilient because we forget our trauma. We are resilient because we refuse to forget. Every scar becomes a lesson. Every wound becomes a teacher. We carry our pain forward not as a burden but as a tool." The assembly was silent, could feel them processing her words, trying to fit this concept into their understanding. "Your data shows that we experience catastrophe after catastrophe," she said. "What it does not show is what happens after. The survivors gather. They mourn. They tell stories about what they lost, and then they start rebuilding. They plant crops in ash. They raise children in ruins. They make jokes about death because laughter is sometimes the only medicine available." A delegate from a species did not recognize spoke up. It resembled a walking tree with bark-like skin and branches for limbs. "You speak of jokes. We have studied this phenomenon. Gallows humor, your species calls it. It makes no sense to us. How does laughter address trauma?" Smiled. It was a sad smile shaped by experience. "Because the alternative is screaming, and screaming does not build anything." She shared more data, medical studies on human stress responses, psychological research on how humor regulated fear, cultural analyses of how dark comedy flourished most in communities that faced the greatest hardships. "When we joke about death, we take away some of its power. When we laugh at our fears, we remind ourselves that we are still here to laugh. It is not a perfect solution. Nothing is. But it keeps us moving forward when everything says we should stop." The archivist representative flickered brightly. "You speak of transforming wounds into memory and purpose, but memory fades, purpose erodes. How do you maintain this across generations? How does the species remember when the individuals who suffered are gone?" Nodded. "This was the heart of it. We tell stories, we write books, we make songs. Every culture on Earth has traditions for passing down the memory of what came before. Some of these traditions are formal, schools and museums and official histories. Some are informal, stories told by grandparents, songs sung at gatherings, warnings whispered from one generation to the next." She brought up images of libraries, theaters, gathering halls where elders spoke to children. "We do not just survive our traumas, we turn them into culture, into identity. We become a species shaped by everything we have endured, not despite our scars but because of them." The delegate spoke again, its voice steadier now. "When our species faced extinction, many of us lost the will to continue. The trauma was too great, the memory too painful. We survived only because a small number refused to give up, but they carried such weight, such sorrow." "Yes," said softly. "We know that weight, we know that sorrow. Every human carries some of it, the loss of loved ones, the cruelty of strangers, the knowledge that our species has done terrible things to itself. We are not light beings, we are heavy with grief." She paused, choosing her next words carefully. "But we have learned to walk with that weight. We have built muscles for carrying sorrow. We have developed techniques for sharing the burden so no one person collapses under it. It is not pleasant, it is not elegant, but it works." The assembly shifted. Something was changing in the atmosphere. The fear and confusion were still present, but something else was emerging. Curiosity, perhaps, or something like respect. Your wound index gave us the highest score in your records, said. You looked at that number and saw a species that should have collapsed, but I look at that number and see something else. I see proof that we have been tested more than any species you have measured, and we are still here, still standing, still reaching for the stars. She straightened her shoulders and met the eyes of as many delegates as she could. We did not come to you as victims asking for help. We came as survivors offering partnership. Whatever challenges this galaxy faces, whatever catastrophes lie ahead, we have experience you lack. We know how to endure the unendurable. We know how to rebuild from nothing. We know how to carry scars without being crippled by them. The chamber was completely silent now, felt the weight of their attention, the pressure of their judgment. She had said what she came to say. The rest was up to them. The question is not whether you can trust beings who have suffered as much as we have, she concluded. The question is whether you can afford not to. She stepped back from the speaking platform. The translation device went quiet, and 400 civilizations began to consider what it meant that the most wounded species they had ever measured was offering to help them survive. The debate that followed Ambassador's address lasted for 3 months by human time. The Galactic Council convened in emergency sessions. The archivists ran simulation after simulation. Species that had not communicated directly in centuries exchanged worried messages about the implications. Senior Archivist observed it all. It had spent its career civilizations, measuring their rises and falls with clinical precision. It had believed that understanding a species was simply a matter of collecting enough data. The humans had proven it wrong. The data said humans should not exist. The models said they should have collapsed a dozen times over. The wound index said they were carrying enough trauma to destroy any species 3 times over. And yet there was Ambassador standing before the council, offering to help others survive. Began a new research project. It went back through the archives, examining every species that had ever exceeded a wound index score of 500. Most had followed predictable patterns. The trauma accumulated. The culture grew darker. The birth rates dropped. Eventually, the species simply stopped continuing. Some ended dramatically in mass suicides or final wars. Others faded quietly, individuals simply choosing not to reproduce until there was no one left. The humans were doing something different. Their birth rates fluctuated but remained stable over. Their culture grew darker and lighter in cycles, processing trauma and then moving forward. They had developed an entire field of study called psychology dedicated to understanding and healing mental wounds. They had institutions specifically designed to help individuals who had experienced trauma. More importantly, they had turned their collective trauma into something like an immune system. Studied human history more carefully than before. It noticed patterns it had missed. After every catastrophe, the humans changed. Not always for the better, but always in ways that addressed what had happened. After plagues, they developed medicine. After wars, they built international organizations to prevent future conflicts. After famines, they revolutionized agriculture. After disasters, they created emergency response systems. They did not just survive their wounds. They learned from them. Every scar became a lesson that changed their entire species. The archivist expanded its research. It examined human art and literature across 5,000 years of recorded history. It found a pattern that no other species had ever displayed. Humans created stories specifically about their own suffering. They wrote tragedies designed to make audiences weep. They composed music that deliberately evoked grief and loss. At first had found this horrifying. Why would any species voluntarily expose themselves to simulated trauma? But closer study revealed the purpose. The humans were training themselves. Every tragedy watched, every sad song heard, every painful story shared prepared them for the real tragedies they would inevitably face. They had created a culture of inoculation against despair. The council debates continued. Some species argued that humans were too dangerous to integrate. Their capacity for violence was well documented. A species that had developed nuclear weapons and nearly used them to destroy itself could not be trusted with galactic technology. Others argued the opposite. The humans had developed those weapons and then stepped back from the brink. They had created international treaties and oversight organizations. They had not destroyed themselves despite having the power to do so. That showed restraint. That showed growth. A third faction argued that the question of danger was irrelevant. The galaxy faced threats that no existing civilization had ever overcome. Extinction-level events that occurred on cosmic timescales. The humans had demonstrated an ability to survive that exceeded all known models. If such threats materialized, the galaxy would need species that knew how to endure the unsurvivable. Was asked to prepare a final report on the humans. It worked for 6 months, synthesizing everything it had learned. The report would help determine humanity's place in the galactic community. It might be the most important document ever produced. The day before the report was due, requested a private meeting with Ambassador. She agreed. They met in a small observation chamber with a window looking out on the galaxy. "I have studied your species for years," said. Its light form flickered with colors had learned to interpret as uncertainty. "I have your history and measured your trauma. I have read your literature and analyzed your psychology, and I still do not fully understand." Sat beside the window, looking out at stars she did not recognize. "What don't you understand?" "How you continue. Not as a species, but as individuals. I have read your file, your personal history, the fire that burned you as a child, the violence that took your family, the failures you have witnessed in your career. By any measure, you should be consumed by bitterness. You should have retreated into isolation or rage. Instead, you volunteered to represent your species to the galaxy." Was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was soft. "Can I tell you a story?" "Please." "When I was a child, after the fire, I spent months in a hospital. The burns covered most of my left side. The pain was constant. I could not sleep without nightmares. I wanted to die. I was 7 years old and I wanted to die." Slight form dimmed with something like sorrow. "There was a nurse who worked in the burn unit. Her name was Maria. She had scars, too, on her hands and arms from a fire when she was young. Every day she came to my room and changed my bandages. Every day she told me stories about her own recovery, how much it hurt, how many times she wanted to give up, how she kept going anyway." Touched the scars on her arm. "She told me that the pain would never fully go away, the scars would never vanish, but she also told me something else. She said that every scar was a door. On one side was the past, the moment of injury. On the other side was the future, everything I could still become. The scar connected them, but it was my choice which way to walk." "And you chose the future." "Not at first. At first I just survived, day by day, hour by hour. But slowly I started to understand what she meant. The fire had happened. Nothing could change that, but what came next was still unwritten. I could let the fire define me, or I could let it teach me." Process this for several cycles. "And what did it teach you?" "That I was stronger than I knew. That pain could be endured. That other people who had suffered could help me survive. And eventually that I could help others in the same way." Smiled. "Maria had survived her fire and become a nurse. She helped me survive mine. Now I try to help my entire species survive whatever comes next. By representing them to the galaxy. By showing them that our scars do not make us weak, they make us qualified." The meeting ended, returned to its report with a new understanding. The final document was presented to the full Galactic Council 1 week later. It began with the wound index score and all the data that supported it. Every catastrophe humans had survived, every self-inflicted wound they had healed. It presented the psychological models and the cultural analyses. Then it went further. It described how humans processed trauma differently than other species, how they created culture specifically designed to help individuals and communities heal, how they transformed their wounds into lessons and their survivors into teachers, how they had built an entire civilization around the principle that scars were not disabilities but credentials. The conclusion surprised everyone, including itself. The wound index was designed to measure accumulated damage, the report stated. It was intended to predict species collapse based on trauma levels. The humans have revealed a fundamental flaw in this approach. Damage alone does not determine outcome. What matters is how the damage is processed. Other species experience trauma as a weight that accumulates until it becomes unbearable. Humans experience trauma as raw material to be transformed. They do not just survive their wounds. They integrate them into their identity, their culture, their very definition of what it means to be human. This has implications beyond the question of human integration. The archivists have spent billions of years measuring species and predicting their fates. The humans suggest that our models are incomplete. Resilience is not a fixed trait. It can be cultivated. It can be learned, perhaps even taught. The final recommendation was simple. Humanity should be granted full integration into the galactic community, not as a damaged species requiring observation, but as a resource. Their unique relationship with trauma represents something no other known species has achieved. When the next extinction-level event threatens this galaxy, we will need partners who know how to survive anything. We will need the ones who learn to heal by never forgetting how to hurt. The vote was not unanimous, but it passed by a wide margin. Ambassador was informed of the decision in a formal ceremony attended by representatives of 400 civilizations. She accepted with grace and with scars, and with the same calm resilience that had carried her people through 12,000 years of history. When she spoke, she thanked the Council not for accepting humanity, but for giving them the opportunity to help. Because that, she explained, was what survivors did. They helped. They taught. They shared the lessons their wounds had taught them so that others might suffer less. And somewhere in the galactic archives, a new entry was added to the eternal records. A species with the highest wound index ever recorded. A species that should have collapsed 100 times over. A species that had turned its scars into strength and its trauma into tools for survival. The most wounded beings the galaxy had ever known, and the most unbroken.